Bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. Every simple step, crossing borders or going on a plane or on a ship, will become more complicated. It's a time to launch a operational, concrete war against terror, even if it takes certain pains from the routine activities of our normal society. This is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. Consistently along 6 or 10 years, Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, this is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order, no world order possible here.
There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a new world order.
There was a great resolution passed at the United Nations last night that might bring about a new order in the world that would be better for all of us.
Preparing for this kind of event for nearly a decade. We've had presidential directives. It's a project called Homeland Defense. It's a project
of purpose. There will be no world order, no world order possible here.
There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a new world order.
It was a total pretext. It's inexplicable. And there you go to Cheney, there you go to Bush, there you go to the Jewish neocons who wanted to remake the world,
That they somehow went to war on a pretext for the state of Israel.
Who said, quote, "We're benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq." End quote.
Type of information that methods of collections that you don't want to share with the local host country, systems that you use, contacts that you make, undercover operations that you penetrating other terrorist networks. Those types of information you don't share with anybody.
To be launched, and I'd mentioned GINZA to you, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the GINZA neocons, and you knew full well what that was because you responded by saying, did I hear what Woolsey, the former CIA director, had said recently on television? He's associated with GINZA and has even said that he held up the Presbyterian wing of GINZA. Now, Colin Powell has also conveyed in the biographical book about him by Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post that the GINZA crowd was in control of the Pentagon, basically. And we know that from the clean break agenda that the Iraq War was based on.
A clean break was written by Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and David Wormser. All three of them had high-ranking positions in the government of Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996, and that paper was written for that administration in Israel. That paper called for three major objectives. Cutting off peace talks with Yasser Arafat, it was 1996, keep in mind. Launching military assaults on the occupied territories of Palestine, and those two things ended up happening. And the third objective was deposing Saddam Hussein. So, 2002, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and David Wormser are now all high-ranking members of the Bush administration. Richard Pearl, head of the Defense Policy Board, which is an advisory group to the Pentagon. A third of its members had ties to companies that got billions of dollars of contracts when we decided to go to war. So again, conflict of interest.
Federal officials have begun a major investigation into whether someone or many people benefited financially from the evil done to the country last Tuesday. Not long before the attacks occurred, there were some financial transactions in the stock market that may indicate knowledge of the attack before it began. ABC's Antonio Mora is here. Whether they ever get to, if they ever get to the bottom of it, it will be astonishing.
Astonishing, no question, Peter. What many Wall Street analysts believe is that the terrorists made bets that a number of stocks would see their prices fall. They did so by buying what are called puts. If you bet right, the rewards can be huge. The risks are also huge, unless, of course, you know something bad is going to happen to the company you're betting against. This could very well be insider trading at the worst, most horrific, most evil use you've ever seen in your entire life. One example, United Airlines. The Thursday before the attack, more than 2,000 contracts betting that the stock would go down were purchased. 90 times more in one day than in 3 weeks. When the markets reopened, United stock dropped. The price of the contracts soared, and someone may have made a lot of money fast. $180,000 turns into $2.4 million when that plane hits the World Trade Center. It's almost the same story with American Airlines. That's a 5-fold increase in the value of what was a $337,000 trade on Monday. All of a sudden becomes what? $1.8 million. And there's much more, including an extraordinarily high number of bets against Morgan Stanley and Marsh & McLennan, two of the World Trade Center's biggest tenants. Could this be a coincidence? This would be one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of mankind if it was a coincidence. It is absolutely unprecedented to see cases of insider trading covering the entire world, from Japan to the United States and North America to Europe. ABC News has now learned that the Chicago Board of Options Exchange launched their investigation into the unusual trading last week. That may have given them enough time to stop anyone from profiting from death here in the U.S. It may also give investigators, Peter, a hot trail that might lead them to the terrorists.
Thanks very much. As a reminder of the complications here, the Secretary of the Treasury said today of this investigation, you've got to go through 10 veils before you get to the real source. Yeah. Thanks, Antonio.
Death of money. Jim Rickards, welcome back to the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, let me read you a quote from your book. Quote, "It was the most blatant case of insider trading I have ever seen." This is a quote from the first chapter of your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the insider trading referred to in Chapter 1 of The Death of Money, Max, has to do with shorting airline stocks in advance of 9/11. So there was insider trading ahead of the 9/11 attack. It was very blatant, very clear. It was not picked up at the time. It was by some people in the market, I should say, but not by the intelligence authorities or any national security officials, but it was seen in the market. That quote that you read, by the way, comes from John Mulheron. John was actually tried and convicted of insider trading related to the 1980s cases in the early 90s. His conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals said the trial court got it right. He was totally exonerated, but I mentioned that only to say that here's a guy who knew about M&A, leaked information, insider trading, etc. He was one of the most famous stock traders on Wall Street, ran one of the largest specialists on the New York Stock Exchange. He was, at the time, the market maker in American Airlines stock. So hard to find anyone who knew more about trading, more about insider trading, market manipulation than John Mulheron. And that conversation took place actually at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. So I was part of an investigation. This all discussed in the book. There's a lot of academic evidence, there's forensic evidence, there's anecdotal evidence, but the case is overwhelming that there was insider trading ahead of 9/11.
All right, you mentioned this CIA headquarters and the fact that there was talk about insider trading ahead of 9/11 in the days leading up to the events of 9/11, particularly 4 days leading up to 9/11, looking at the forensic evidence and looking at markets as a way to aggregate lots and lots of data. And you talk about this in your book, the way that your team presents to the CIA a way of what you call market intelligence, or MarkEnt, which is to use this very sensitive options market as a way to give a telltale sign of activity that's happening around the world and whether potentially this would flag a terrorist attack. So in the days leading up to the 9/11, in the options market, in those airline options, you have concluded without any equivocation that there was insider trading on those options leading up to the event, correct?
Well, that's my conclusion, Max, but it's not just my conclusion. As I mentioned, there are 3 major academic studies as well as other anecdotal evidence all pointing in the same direction. So to me, it's an open and shut case. It's all described in the book, which is heavily footnoted, I should say. So it's not just sort of wild speculation. I think it's very well documented. We take a look at the 9/11 Commission report, which reached a different conclusion, but I sort of deconstruct their famous footnote where they describe why they reached the conclusion and show what the flaws are in the footnote, what the flaws are in the forensic technique that the 9/11 Commission used. But your larger point that markets give us price signals, we know that, but how to look behind the price signal and understand exactly what's going on. By the way, this technique, which we explored for the CIA, is a completely normal technique used by hedge funds every day. Now, hedge funds are looking for insider trading around M&A deals. They're looking for a leak. You know, we see this all the time. A stock suddenly soars for no reason. There's no news. Maybe the market's flattened down, but a particular stock goes way up, and everyone said, gee, what's happening with that stock? And then 3 days later, we find out that it's the subject of a takeover that's announced, but clearly the takeovers don't come out of the thin air. They're, lawyers and accountants and experts and managers work on these things for weeks and sometimes months, and that's the inside group. But sometimes the information leaks out, people trade on it, and you see the price action ahead of the announcement. That's exactly what we saw in 9/11. There was massive, massive buying of put options, and of course when you buy a put option, that's a bet that the stock is going to go down. Massive buying of put options on American Airlines and United Airlines in the last several trading days ahead of 9/11. And again, that's been studied extensively, so I don't think there's any question that it was insider trading. I should add, however, that
Scholl, we know from statements from Deutsche Bank here in Europe that these trades were done at Alex Brown, which is a firm not too far from the CIA, who was run by Buzzy Krongard. When I was working at Alex Brown, he was leading up the firm. He then took a job as the deputy director of the CIA under George Tenet during the events of 9/11. So here you have a firm in Baltimore where the trades were done that was run by the guy who's now the deputy director at the CIA. Your thoughts, your comments?
Well, Buzzy Krongard, former Alex Brown executive, was executive director of the CIA at the time. I haven't looked at all at the Alex Brown trading. To me, it's sort of irrelevant. What I look at is the market as a whole. What we were saying was really coming through the specialists. Now, you're exactly right, Max. I make the point in the book, nobody trades alone. If you're trading with somebody. So what I really focused on is the overall market action, not any particular firm, but could you tell from the price action and the volume and the momentum itself that something was going on at the time? And of course, we reached the conclusion that something was going on, which was obviously this 9/11 attack was about to happen. But I focused a lot on what's called signal amplification. And just to explain that for the viewers, you could have a very small terrorist trade, meaning, a few thousand shares. Well, someone sees that. It doesn't make the person who sees it a terrorist. They're just a specialist or a hedge fund or someone is kind of watching the tape, and they say, you know what, there's no reason for the stock to be going down. There's no reason for anyone to be buying puts. Someone knows something I don't, and they'll buy more puts. That then puts more pressure on the stock. There's more put buying. So by the end of the day, you may have millions of shares that have traded. It doesn't mean all those people are terrorists or insiders. That's actually legitimate trading. If you're watching the tape and you do what I call a piggyback trade on the original trade, that's actually not illegal. And all those people are not terrorists. Only the original trade, my example, a couple thousand shares would have been the terror trade. The rest of it is piggybacking or signal amplification. But this is where the 9/11 Commission fell down, because when they went back to investigate after the fact, they looked at the big guys. The big guys are invariably not the insider traders. They're not the terrorists. They're the guys piggybacking. You got to go all the way down to that small initial trade to find it, and that's what we did on a multi-year strategic study for the CIA. We basically explained how you could use that forensic technique, that market information, possibly to detect the next spectacular terrorist
Right, you talk about signal amplification. When I was talking to Cantor Fitzgerald brokers and bankers in the days leading up to 9/11, they themselves were buying these airline puts. They told me, based on rumors that were coming out of Alex Brown, associated with Buzzy Krongard. So this looks to me as if CIA insiders knew enough about what was going on, but chose to make money rather than blowing trade options. You have to do it through a broker. We know from the investigative journalism of Lars Scholl, we know from statements from Deutsche Bank here in Europe, that these trades were done at Alex Brown, which is a firm not too far from the CIA, who was run by Buzzy Krongard. When I was working at Alex Brown, he was leading up the firm. He then took a job as the deputy director of the CIA under George Tenet during the events of 9/11. So here you have a firm in Baltimore where the trades were done that was run by the guy who's now the deputy director at the CIA. When I was talking to Cantor Fitzgerald brokers and bankers in the days leading up to 9/11, they themselves were buying these airline puts. They told me, based on rumors that were coming out of Alex Brown associated with Buzzy Krongard. So this looks to me as if CIA insiders knew enough about what was going on, but chose to make money rather than blowing the whistle.
They're made. Oppenheimer and Morgan Stanley are warned on the 6th and the 7th. Goldman Sachs are warned. Wanted a put option, didn't grab his money quick enough, so 2.5 million was sort of set aside for whomever, and the SEC said, we're going to give you the list of every person who made the put options because they knew it, they were in on it, and they made money on it. Murder in the first is when you plan it and you make a gain with that murder. That options placed on September 10th. Now, the SEC promised, we will give you the name of every person who knew it was going to happen and made money on it. Well, they didn't. But there's a paper down there that I have from them. It's one of these papers here. You'll get it. It's down here somewhere. But anyway, what they did say, the SEC did say, we can't give you, now this is how they backed out of it. They said, put options are not really insider trading. Of course they are. I'm quoting them. Not really insider trading, but are merely foreknowledge of events. Well, what the hell is foreknowledge of events? That's what you use for insider trading. So the SEC said that, okay? That's what it is. And so they said, okay, we're not giving you the names, but we will tell you this. All the put options came from Israel. Put options are not really insider trading. Of course they are. I'm quoting them. Not really insider trading, but are merely foreknowledge of events. Well, what the hell is foreknowledge of events? That's what you use for insider trading. So the SEC said that, okay? That's what it is. And so they said, okay, we're not giving you the names, but we will tell you this. All the put options came from Israel. Okay?
The building is going to contain not 2 million feet, but 1.7 million. And that's one of the sacrifices we have to make. I said, let's make it and let's get on with it. And so, next thing you know, we've got the designs of the building. And the first design meeting was in April of 2000. And construction began shortly thereafter in 2002.
(9/11) hearings, Condoleezza Rice is asked about this presidential briefing, and she says, we didn't think it had anything to do with anything specific. It seemed to be just some general thing that we already knew, that bin Laden had some plans to attack the United States, and we didn't consider it all that significant. But you point out something in the book I thought was quite interesting, I personally hadn't seen before, which is in something called the SEIB, the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief, which is essentially normally, if I understand correctly, more or less what's in the presidential brief, but it goes to many more people. That whole memo on bin Laden has been taken out. Well, if they consider it so not of any great significance one way or the other, why on earth would they take it out?
One explanation would be that they didn't want there to be a broadcast of the possibility that we might be under specific threat of terrorists using airplanes.
I didn't see that, but the one thing at the time I wasn't really questioning anything. I mean, I was just shocked. But the one thing that I thought was odd was not long after it happened, I lived on Houston Street, and it's a main street, and there was this line of trucks to pick up the debris from the site, and there must have been, I don't know, a couple hundred of them, of these government pickup trucks, not pickup trucks, dump trucks. Dump trucks, yeah. And they just came out of nowhere, like they were ready to go on site. I don't know if anybody's ever talked about this before. I witnessed it, I have pictures of it. And it was just odd that they were so prepared and so ready and so quick to be on the scene to pick up debris from an accident that they...
Right, there's a building.
Right, that's why it's so dark.
Yeah, because it's still burning. There's like ambulances everywhere. Look, Houston is roped off down there. You see it? The police have it roped off. Why? Oh, anything going downtown? But there's more cops right here. Look. Look at this. This is a major thoroughfare where we are. I know. Were they getting bodies out? It does. And this is a major corner. That's what's going on.
This is going to, yeah, the population is starting to get debris out.
It's wild out here. They just keep coming. Look. It doesn't stop. There's more.
so necessary to move this massive amount of wreckage?
We saw that all accumulating by late afternoon. I haven't myself seen any of the National Guard yet, but by late afternoon there were dozens of fire trucks, these enormous pieces of heavy machinery like the front-end loaders coming on trailers, some of them. They were all in position here in these side streets out behind where the trade towers stood not so long ago. And at first there was a bit of traffic jam out here and real gridlock as the men in charge of coordinating all of this effort tried to figure out how to get things into position. But that's all been cleared up pretty much now. They closed down the city completely. There's also no electricity here.
Tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place, and then an hour after the first hit here, with the first crash that took place, he said there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. One of the secondary devices he thinks that took place after the initial impact was, he thinks, may have been on the plane that crashed into one of the towers. The second device he thinks, he speculates, was probably planted in the building. So that's what we have been told by Albert Terry, who is the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He told me that just earlier.
The second tower of the World Trade Center collapsing. About 8 minutes after that, a fourth explosion at the World Trade Center, perhaps at the base of the building.
We certainly would understand
that. A fourth explosion at the World Trade Center, perhaps at the base of the building.
We certainly would understand, but keep in mind that what you're seeing on your screen right now is live. This is not tape at all. This is the only remaining World Trade Center tower. The other collapsing not too long ago. Both victims of plane crashes. The tower that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And then there were reports of an explosion before the tower fell, then a strange sucking sound followed by the sound of floors collapsing.
I'm hearing the whole thing, and I can tell you that the air pressure changed. It was like all of a sudden being like in a submarine 300 feet below the surface.
World Trade Center. What happened? And the whole place just filled up with smoke. I popped our ears, we couldn't hear anything down there. Smoke, I popped our ears, we couldn't hear anything down there.
Collapsed. We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed. And then one person described it as a strange sucking noise as the buildings did implode after that. Now,
suddenly I heard. Suddenly I heard.
There was another explosion down there. That's there was another explosion down there.
In my earlier video entitled South Tower Smoking Guns, I pointed out a projectile near the end of the clip that moves to the right, then suddenly turns through a sharp angle and moves downward, at least from the perspective of the camera, all the while producing a trail of white smoke. For this object to radically change directions like this, it had to experience a sudden impulse. In my earlier video entitled South Tower Smoking Guns, I pointed out a projectile near the end of the clip that moves to the right, then suddenly turns through a sharp angle and moves downward, at least from the perspective of the camera, all the while producing a trail of white smoke. For this object to radically change directions like this, it had to experience a sudden impulse. For this object to radically change directions like this, it had to experience a sudden impulse. For this object to radically change directions like this, it had to experience a sudden impulse. In my earlier video entitled South Tower Smoking Guns, I pointed out a projectile near the end of the clip that moves to the right, then suddenly turns through a sharp angle and moves downward, at least from the perspective of the camera, all the while producing a trail of white smoke. For this object to radically change directions like this, it had to experience a sudden impulse.
A number of updates. Number one, CNN is now reporting that there was a third explosion at the World Trade Center, probably an explosion from the ground that caused World Trade Center 1 to collapse on top of itself. Again, there was a third explosion. It's unclear. A number of updates. Number one, CNN is now reporting that there was a third explosion at the World Trade Center, probably an explosion from the ground that caused World Trade Center 1 to collapse on top of itself. Again, there was a third explosion. It's unclear what caused it, whether it was a bomb or whether the first plane that crashed into the tower had somehow been booby-trapped with a bomb that was timed to explode later after the crash had occurred. But CNN is reporting that there was a third explosion that caused World Trade Center 1 to collapse within itself and then collapse on other surrounding buildings.
When the second tower of the Trade Center collapsed, 8 minutes later, another explosion at the World Trade Center. Apparently, bombs may have been placed at the base of those buildings. The mayor only saying he did not believe those blasts after the initial impact had anything to do with a gas leak. That was an initial report from the mayor. It has been, again, just over 7 hours since this began.
I looked behind me and I saw the building look like it was coming.
Departures. We were watching on our Flight Explorer. I don't know if we can put it on the air right now. This is a system in which we can actually look at the number of airplanes in the air. Normally this would be dotted with little blue airplane figures. Look at how few we're looking. It looks like only 3 over the immediate New York City metropolitan area. Just a handful. Airplanes in the air are being allowed to land at their destinations, and then that is it. And then that is it. Now keep in mind, the planes you're looking at here are only those that are participating in the FAA radar system, airliners. This does not include anybody in a small Cessna or a small plane who might be flying. What's called VFR traffic, where they're just flying below the commercial traffic. But again, these represent commercial airplanes or airplanes that are participating in the FAA system. Just a handful in the skies over the Northeast right now. Greg, Chris?
Watching continuing NBC News coverage on MSNBC of a series of apparent
A small plane who might be flying.
Evening of September 10th, 2001, at Dulles International Airport. The rush was over. Argonne-Bright security employee Eric Gill had just returned to supervising the West checkpoint. He saw something strange. Gill, a Pakistani man who fled to the U.S. to escape religious persecution, did not want his face shown.
I saw about 5 Middle Eastern people. They were walking to the side door we have at West Checkpoint, which is accessed by only few restricted people. I noticed that 3 of them were wearing a uniform and IDs. 2 other guys who were not wearing a uniform and had no IDs, and they were trying to escort these 2 guys through there. As soon as they walked inside the checkpoint, they just stopped there and started watching around. That made me suspicious.
Gill's suspicions were well placed. The men, dressed in United Airlines ground workers' uniforms, wanted access to a door that led to the concourse and parked planes. The men tried to use one electronic badge to swipe through. Gill stopped them.
They didn't like it, and he abused me, and he said, "F*** off. We are people you don't know. You should be allowed to go through here, but you make your own rules." And he just walked out with it.
Eric Gill and other witnesses took no further action, but the Middle Eastern men were not through. Gill would later identify 2 of the men as the Al-Qaeda hijackers of a plane from Boston, as well as American Airlines Flight 77.
Probably the most incredible incredibly poor decision made by the authorities was that the key security guard at Dulles Airport, who was the last man between the airplanes and the hijackers, was never questioned about what he saw on the night of September 10th.
With color photographs of the hijackers that he was finally able to make a positive ID.
And I said, these two guys, I have seen them. I know these were the two who were there at the airport.
It didn't matter. The FBI was done with Gill.
We don't know if there were accomplices working at Dulles Airport with the hijackers that were never arrested. And this is one of the biggest holes in the 9/11 case.
They knew right away, and there was many of people coming through that checkpoint at the same time.
But Ed, how would they know? The FBI claimed they had no idea who these hijackers were.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, it boggles my mind.
What it says to me is if they knew them that morning, they knew who they were the day before, and they should have been able to catch them before they got to the airport.
Orders arrived from Washington, D.C., the headquarters of the Federal Aviation Administration. They want Anchorage Center to tell the Korean airliner to change its squawk to 7500, the emergency number to be used only in one situation: hijack. This order would make KAL Flight 085 the only airliner in the sky on 9/11, and perhaps ever, to deliberately squawk 7500. For 18 long minutes, Anchorage Center does not act on Washington's order. Phone calls are made to question the order because it is so unusual and because lives are at stake. Exactly who talked to who and what was said is being withheld by authorities. What is unexplained is why the aircraft was ordered to turn on its hijack signal, and which agencies were in the know about that decision.
Yeah, I've never had to issue a hijack squawk to an aircraft. I mean, we can issue an emergency code if we think the aircraft is having an issue, and what they do when they squawk, there's 3 particular codes that they can squawk, and it's basically emergency radio failure hijack. And it actually tags up on other controller scopes, and also scopes down the lower 48, if like at the command center, anybody, probably the military. I can't really speak to how their equipment works, but it just kind of tags them up a little bit differently. So it's a more pronounced target on the scope. So I've never had to do it before. I never had to do it after that. It was a strange request at the time. I never read it in the books where you had to do that. I've never, you know, we wouldn't necessarily ever issue that code to an aircraft because the way I look at it, it's not ours to issue, it's the pilot's to issue because it's a very serious code. So the 7500 squawk was the hijack code. Was actually a supervisor came down and said we need to have the Korean Air squawk 7500, and I said, well, I didn't really think it was the right thing to do. So they actually left and regrouped and talked about it, and I had my opinions of why it wasn't, but then later I was ordered to do it. So.
And what were your thoughts? Why did you not want to do that?
We'd already had some miscommunication with the military that morning. There'd already been some threats to shoot down some aircraft, one that I was particularly working, or probably others that happened to, that if they didn't follow whatever air traffic commands that we issued at the time, that they would be shot down. And I had an aircraft that was just south of Anchorage. On his way in, he was told to land at Anchorage. And at 40 miles south of Anchorage, I was told to turn him or he would be shot down. And
24, Anchorage Center radios Korean Air Flight 085 and delivers this astonishing message.
Korean Air 085 Center.
Yes, Center, Korean Air 085, go ahead.
Korean Air 085, squawk 75.
Confirm squawk 75 with 00.
Korean Air 085, affirmative.
What could possibly explain this strange and monumental instruction? To this day, even the RCMP are as much in the dark as anyone else.
speaking to the pilot, I mean, he was quite adamant, you know, that he was instructed. I mean, that was his explanation, that he was instructed to. And he thought that was a strange request at the time.
The dangerous order is given to the airliner at about the same time it is directed to fly to Whitehorse. For the next 90 minutes, as it cruises at 37,000 feet over the skies of Alaska and the Yukon, Korean Air 085 emits the ominous hijack signal continuously until it is on the ground in Whitehorse. As Yukon schools evacuate and ring their fire alarm bells, the hostile 747 enters Canadian airspace, along with the cargo flight 281, 2 fighter jets, an AWACS surveillance aircraft, and at least 1 refueling jet for the F-15s. Flight 085 is handed off from Anchorage Center to Edmonton Air Traffic Control, squawking 7500 and running low on fuel because of the extra time and distance it has had to travel. In Whitehorse, RCMP Inspector Grant is sure of one thing: it was not a language problem.
Time, which is interesting, and they've tried to explain that away as well. She'd already told somebody at American Airlines that it was Flight 12, and that's the other American Airlines person saying that. But that means she said it misidentified the flight twice as Flight 12. It was supposed to be Flight 11. Flight 12, of course, was the reverse flight of Flight 11. Flight 11 was Boston to Los Angeles. Flight 12 was Los Angeles to Boston. Now, the official explanation for this is all that she was nervous about the hijacking, so she mixed up the flight number and wasn't that understandable. But the problem comes with the other flight attendant, Madeline Amy Sweeney, also misidentified it as Flight 12. And let's quote the FBI's records. They're talking about Sweeney's call to Evelyn Nunez and American Airlines Services, quote, Flight 12 at Gate 32 had 2 flight attendants stabbed, unquote. And that call was cut off quickly. She called back again and got Michael Woodward in American Airlines Flight Services, and he wrote down Flight 12 and crossed it out and put Flight 11. So both flight attendants made the same mistake. How could they both make that error and call it Flight 12? Well, it certainly looks like this is a scripted drill. The script has misidentified the flight as 12 instead of 11. Eventually, the flight attendants got it out with the director of the drill, and but there's no way that both flight attendants could have made the same mistake. Throat cut. Yeah. 2 flight attendants have been stabbed, and there's not even a quiver in Ong's voice. She's very calm, and this has been attributed to her professionalism, and I want to say that I believe she was professional, but I think that the reason for the calmness in the flight attendants' calls is because they really thought they were just in a drill.
It was a drill.
It's not a slur. It's not, we're not slighting their professionalism, but they're so calm in the middle of this bloodshedding because they think that it's really just a drill and they're just reading from a script. And there's other anomalies, too, in this call. She said that the hijacker stood upstairs, and you'll find this in the FBI documents, which I linked to from the web article. Now, here's the problem with that, Richie, is that Boeing 747s have stairs, but Boeing 767s, which this flight was, do not have any stairs. The 747s do have stairs leading to the cockpit. The idea what she was conveying was that there was a hijacker standing on the stairs guarding the way to the cockpit. Well, that couldn't be. And so once again, we're confronted with, apparently you've got a script writer for this drill who'd been used to traveling on 747s. And
through his lawyer, has told the FBI that al-Omari is actually safe in Saudi Arabia and should be presenting himself to U.S. officials in that country. We were told he would be presenting himself yesterday. And they are claiming, those associates of al-Omari who are in custody, one associate of al-Omari, is claiming that all of this associating to them is a case of mistaken identity. So we must tell viewers that while there are names on this list, it could be that they are perhaps stolen identity. Leon?
All right, Eileen O'Connor, thank you very much.
Saw one of them. His partner said they've got 2 more to give 3 out of the 4 black boxes. And we've also talked to an airline investigative specialist who says never in the annals of history have they ever found where they couldn't at least find the black boxes? You guys, everybody at this site went through that debris with such a fine-tooth comb. They were finding bone fragments the size of nail clippings and DNA matching it. Yet we're told the black boxes, for the first time in history, destroyed, gone, never found them. I'm expected to believe that. You believe that? Then where are they?
I don't know where they are. I don't know where they are. I don't know where they are.
Even bin Laden's displays of strength for the Western media were faked. The fighters in this video had been hired for the day and told to bring their own weapons. For beyond his own small group, bin Laden had no formal organization, until the Americans invented one for him. In January 2001, a trial began in a Manhattan courtroom of 4 men accused of the embassy bombings in East Africa. But the Americans had also decided to prosecute bin Laden in his absence. But to do this under American law, the prosecutors needed evidence of a criminal organization, because as with the mafia, that would allow them to prosecute the head of the organization, even if he could not be linked directly to the crime. And the evidence for that organization was provided for them by an ex-associate of bin Laden's called Jamal al-Fadl.
During the investigation of the 1998 bombings, there is a walk-in source, Jamal al-Fadl, who's a Sudanese militant who was with bin Laden in the early 90s, who has been passed around a whole series of Middle Eastern secret services, none of whom want much to do with him, who ends up in America and is taken on by the American government effectively as a key prosecution witness and given a huge amount of American taxpayers' money at the same time. His account is used as raw material to build up a picture of Al-Qaeda. The picture that the FBI want to build up is one that will fit the existing laws that they will have to use to prosecute those responsible for the bombing. Now, those laws were drawn up to counteract organised crime, the mafia, drugs crime, crimes where people being a member of an organisation is extremely important. You have to have an organisation to get a prosecution. And you have al-Fadl and a number of other witnesses, a number of other sources who are happy to feed into this, who've got material that, looked at in a certain way, can be seen to show this organisation's existence. You put the two together and you get what is the first bin Laden myth, the first Al-Qaeda myth, and because it's one of the first, it's extremely influential.
The picture al-Fadl drew for the Americans of bin Laden was of an all-powerful figure at the head of a large terrorist network that had an organised hierarchy of control. He also said that bin Laden had given this network a name, Al-Qaeda. It was a dramatic and powerful picture of bin Laden, but it bore little relationship to the truth. The reality was that bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri had become the focus of a loose association of disillusioned Islamist militants who were attracted by the new strategy. But there was no organisation. These were militants who mostly planned their own operations and looked to bin Laden for funding and assistance. He was not their commander. There is also no evidence that bin Laden used the term Al-Qaeda to refer to the name of a group until after September the 11th, when he realised that this was the term the Americans had given him.
The Taliban. Are you still of the view that Al-Qaeda is more of a myth than a reality? It's what you said last year. You also said you weren't even sure that they existed. Really?
Exactly, that's my view today as well.
That Al-Qaeda is a myth?
It is for me a myth. I have never had a report from any Afghan source on Al-Qaeda or what they were doing. We don't see them, we cannot visualize them. For us, they don't exist. I've never had a report from our intelligence, I've never had a report from our people, I've never come across them.
Did they exist in September the 11th? On September the 11th, 2001, was Al-Qaeda operating in Afghanistan?
I have come across the Taliban, I've come across other groups, I've come across the people called, calling themselves different names, different outfits of extremists and terrorists. We have reports about them. I don't know if Al-Qaeda existed and I don't know if they exist. For me, it's a myth. I have to feel tangible about it before I can say they are there. Well, reports say they are there, but I have no information.
Your allies in the U.S. government,
se.
your allies in the U.S. government, NATO forces on the ground in Afghanistan all said that they were there fighting Al-Qaeda fighters. When you say it's a myth, you've not seen any evidence, did they call you a conspiracy theorist? Some might say you sound like a conspiracy theorist.
Well, if saying that something does not exist does not mean a conspiracy. It's my judgment, it's my feeling. Maybe they are there, but I have not seen them and I have not had a report about them. Any report that would indicate that Al-Qaeda is operating in Afghanistan. And I've also been in conversation with various American officials. The last one that I had was last year, in which they told me that there are perhaps not even more than 30 to 35 individuals. So if that's the entire strength of an organization, for me, that's a myth.
Yeah, well, the meeting was for my own newspaper, the London Independent, not for The Nation, though I did write a piece for The Nation. It was looking back on it, I suppose it was a prescient meeting, although at the time, of course, it was interesting enough. We knew that the Americans were fingering bin Laden as the man behind attacks on American troops in the Gulf. We knew that bin Laden was being accused of running an international network of World Terror Inc. And when I approached him, I think he thought I was going to ask him about World Terror Inc. But in fact, copy as a newspaper later on. And apparently he thought it was fair. He expected it was all going to be about World Terror Inc.
Hey, so I work at a very prestigious hospital. I ran into someone who was under a little sedation and spilled a lot of info. Let's just say he has blood ties to some very prominent figures. If you want, you can call me. Separate instances. Info about 9/11 and cancer research using nanotechnology. Let's just say his wife's bloodline rhymes with the name Meghan. This gentleman was the consultant on the Star Wars project. Yes, I'll never forget it. Dude was part of the Reagan administration. He mentioned thermite explosives.
Pieces of structural steel that could have proved the temperature the steel had reached and the use of explosives. Why did Tower 2 that was hit last?
Addresses, phone numbers, names, email addresses, and large fragments of conversation over digital telecommunications networks. The log file spans the entire 48 hours, between September 11, 2001 and September 12, 2001, capturing all unencoded digital communications sent in the USA. Through analysis, the messages can be pieced together to form full conversations, and some can even be pieced together to find the emails and names of those whom sent the messages. Upon preliminary analysis, a couple communication lines have been identified of those used by the Secret Service. The messages revealed that members of the Secret Services were ordered to not enter NYC, and agents embedded in the city were led through several meeting points. At one point they were ordered to evacuate Stuyvesant High School, in the words of command, by any means necessary. Towards the end of the day, the Secret Service was ordered to meet at Chelsea Pier to board a ferry to depart NYC. This just in itself raises several questions. Firstly, what were SS agents doing in New York, and why weren't they ever made aware of there being a terrorist threat? Secondly, why were they ordered to leave the city, instead of staying planted to investigate? Thirdly, who or what was it at Stuyvesant High School, whom were so important it had to be evacuated, by any means necessary? Why were SS agents ordered to stay home on September 12? And lastly, what was the purpose of boarding a ferry, where was its destination, and who exactly other than the SS were on board? This is only a tiny fraction of a large amount of relevant and secretive information contained in the documents. This data can be correlated to many of the facts of the 9/11 cover-up we have already discovered. By using this data, a minute-by-minute analysis of the events of the day in detail, including communications between important players on the subject, can easily be created. Thus, we will finally have a full and detailed picture of the true events of September 11th, along with the evidence to take those responsible to court for a long overdue prosecution.